She came into his life quietly, like a warm breeze before a storm unnoticed, until everything began to shift. Her name wasn't etched in neon lights or carried on the wind, but it didn't need to be. She had that kind of presence that didn't demand attention, it invited it. At first, he didn't even realize how much space she was starting to take up in his mind. It began with small things, a laugh shared over coffee, the way she tilted her head when she listened, the rare silence that never felt uncomfortable. There were no fireworks, no grand declarations, just a slow unfolding. And somehow, in the middle of that ordinary beginning, he felt something crack open inside him. He hadn't known how numb he'd become. Work, routine, surface-level friendships. He had been floating, existing, not living. But with her it was like his life turned, from grayscale to color. The way she saw the world, the questions she asked, the comfort she brought just by being near it, woke something up. He started showing up more for his own life. He laughed louder, felt deeper, even dressed better. He noticed details again them. Sky at sunset, the smell of rain on asphalt, the ache in his chest when she smiled at someone else. And though he never said it out loud, she became his favorite part of every day. But even then, somewhere deep beneath the warmth, there was a quiet fear, a whisper that it wouldn't last. That maybe this was borrowed light, not something he was meant to keep. Still, he held on. He didn't know that this chapter would end without warning, without a clean exit. All he knew was that when she left, it felt like someone turned off the color again. And no matter how much time passed, her shadow kept showing up, invited, unforgettable. It kept replaying. It's the last conversation, the silence after, the way her eyes didn't look the same. He'd go back to that moment in his head like it was a scene from a film he couldn't stop watching, looking for signs. Hidden meanings, some missed detail that would make it all make sense. He'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, remembering every word they said or didn't say, how her voice was calm to calm, how she avoided eye contact when she said, "I just don't feel it anymore." It wasn't even anger that followed. It was confusion, emptiness, as if something vital had been ripped away. All that was left was noise. He tried to move on, tried to fill the silence with distractions. Friends, work, music loud enough to drown out thoughts. But still, her name echoed in his mind like a rhythm that refused to fade. There was no closure, no grand finale, just an unfinished sentence, and that's what made it worse. It didn't feel like she left, more like she evaporated. One day she was there, the next she was gone, and everything she ever touched in his life now felt haunted. He started editing the past. Maybe if he'd said something different. Maybe if he'd opened up sooner. Maybe if he had just fought harder. These maybes turned into daily mantras, twisted prayers to a story that no longer existed. The truth, though sat in the silence he refused to face, she wasn't coming back. But his mind didn't want to let go. It wanted to rewrite, to fix, to imagine a version of events where they still made sense. Because the alternative, the reality, meant accepting that some stories don't end with clarity. Some just stop. And sometimes that's the wound that takes longest to heal. He used to think she completed him, that without her, something vital would always be missing. That belief didn't come from logic. It was something deeper, emotional, instinctual. It felt like fate at the time, like all the broken parts of his life had finally fit together. But now, looking back, he began to understand it wasn't completeness he felt. It was a reflection. She didn't fix him. She didn't save him. Simply held up a mirror that revealed a version of himself he hadn't seen in years. The version who laughed without caution, who dreamed without apology, who loved without keeping score. There was power in that danger too. Because when she walked away, he didn't just lose her, he lost that reflection. It felt like watching your own shadow vanish in the dark. The man she had drawn out of him, the man he liked being, disappeared the moment she did. And so he stopped showing up, stopped chasing passions, stopped believing he could still be that version of himself. On his own? The worst part, he didn't even realize he was shrinking. He just assumed life was dull again because she wasn't in it. But truth has a way of surfacing, and eventually it hit him. She was never the source, just the spark. That light he loved wasn't borrowed from her. It was his all along. She simply brought it to the surface, and that realization, it hurt. Not because it made her less important, but because it meant the real work was his to do now. If he ever wanted to feel that alive again, he couldn't wait for another mirror. He'd have to become his own. The growth she inspired didn't have to end with her. Could begin again, this time not for love, but for self. He kept holding on to a version of her that never really existed. It took time to realize it. At first, she lived in every memory as flawless, gentle, understanding, always knowing what to say. His mind polished her edges, softened the arguments, erased the awkward silences and misunderstandings. The longer she was gone, the more perfect she became in his thoughts. But that wasn't true. It was fantasy, a carefully curated highlight reel stitched together by loneliness and longing. And he clung to it because it felt better than facing the messy reality they actually lived in. There were cracks in what they had. He knew that. Times when he felt misunderstood. Small moments where he questioned if he was really seen. But his heart didn't like those memories, so his mind quietly buried them. Instead, it rewrote her into someone who always got him, who would have stayed if only timing had been kinder. That version of Hertha, dream girl, was easier to grieve than the complicated real one who left, and so he stayed stuck, comparing everyone new to a ghost who never truly existed. No one measured up, because no one was ever allowed to. That fantasy became a wall. It kept him from healing, from connection, from the raw and imperfect beauty of reality. Real people come with scars, baggage, hard days. But none of them stood a chance against the imagined perfection he'd created in his head. And deep down, he knew why he did it. The fantasy was safe, predictable. She couldn't hurt him there. But the truth was harsher. He wasn't in love with her anymore. He was in love with a filtered memory. And as long as he kept holding on to that illusion, he'd never be able to make room for something real, something true, something now. He didn't want to admit it at first, but the obsession wasn't really about her. It was about him, about everything he didn't want to face. Thinking about her, analyzing the past, rereading old texts, scrolling through her social media, those things felt like action. It's like maybe if he just found the right memory, the missing detail, he could make sense of it all. But deep down, it wasn't about understanding hurt. It was about avoiding himself, because the moment he stopped thinking about her, the silence got loud. And in that silence lived all the questions he didn't want to answer. Who had he become? What had he tolerated in the name of love? What patterns had he ignored just to feel wanted? These weren't easy questions. They required honesty, vulnerability, accountability, and that was scary. So instead, he kept spinning in circles, making her the center of the story because it distracted him from the truth that healing wasn't about her at all. It was about the parts of himself he kept running from. She became a symbol, a shield from the work he wasn't ready to do. Real healing meant looking in the mirror and admitting he'd abandoned parts of himself long before she ever did. That maybe he'd lost himself in the relationship not because of her, but because he never fully knew who he was to begin with. And admitting that hurt more than losing her ever did. But eventually he had to stop. Not for her, not for closure, but for his own peace. Obsession wasn't love. It was fear disguised as longing. And once he really saw it, he realized the only way out wasn't through her memory. It was through himself. It's through the growth, the grief, the grit of becoming whole again.